Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro. So let's take a look at Chapter 9 of the American Pageant, which focuses on the new government. And again, the new government begins immediately after the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to take a look at some of the stuff in here. So one of the very first things that we're going to take a look at is the American Revolution. It's considered more of an accelerated evolution rather than a revolution, right? Because if you think about it, we are still in the process of, if you think of the Declaration of Independence as being the sort of catalyst to democracy, we are still in the process of trying to fulfill for every man, woman, and child in our country the promises of the Declaration, right? That everybody is going to be treated with the same equality. And so we are an accelerated, right? Because in the very beginning, especially, right, women, African Americans, Native Americans, men who did not own land, they were not seen with the same equality. One of the things that we'll see too, right, is that there was an exodus of about 80,000 loyalists. So the word exodus means like massive amount of people leaving. And so because so many loyalists had left, a lot of the conservative voices about democracy and equality and loyalty to a monarchy, that was gone. So those people were not there. The Anglican Church, which was the tax-supported church, especially in the South, right, because under the English crown it was, became in the South, and just in general, it became known as the Protestant Episcopal Church. And that's when sometimes they'll hear people say that they're Episcopalians, which is just a sect of Protestantism. 1775, Philadelphia, the Quakers formed the world's first anti-slavery society. That's going to play a major role, especially with the conversation of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Women, right? So one of the key things, right, is women during the war had actually served disguised as men. You'll see this throughout War of 1812, Civil War. One of the things that we saw was that Abigail Adams, right? She immediately to her husband, right, began to say, hey, women should be treated. You guys don't forget the ladies, right? Like, don't forget to invest in the women too, and treat women with more fairness. And so after the war, even though women did not receive the same treatment as men, one of the things that did develop is something that became known as the Republican motherhood. It actually elevated women to a higher social status. And basically what they said was, look, women are at home, and since they are at home taking care of the children, especially the young men, women should teach the children about democracy. And so they became sort of the safekeepers, right, or the teachers of democracy, the first teachers of democracy. But this is going to have monumental consequences, right? Because if women are going to be the ones teaching the children about democracy, not only do they control the message, right? But eventually some of these women are going to say, hey, wait a minute, like, we're teaching all these kids about democracy, yet we don't have democracy for ourselves. And so the Republican motherhood is going to become really important in terms of being sort of a root of the women's suffragist movement. So one of the things that the founding fathers did immediately is the Continental Congress, right? They said, look, the very first thing we need to do is that the colonies themselves can no longer be colonies. They need to be states. And so they tore up their colonial charters and they began drafting constitutions. Massachusetts is going to play a very big role because they're actually going to do it through a convention system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. Constitutions were really important because they were fundamental law, which meant that the laws were written, right? So if someone tries to do something that they shouldn't be doing to you, let's say the police or something, you can pull out the Constitution, right? Like a hand-dandy Constitution pocket book and be like, well, actually you can't, right? So when things are written down, they are the law, and so they can't be changed. One of the things that's also really important is many of the state constitutions, many of the state governments, had actually added a Bill of Rights, essentially outlining the rights of the citizens of that state, residents of that state had. And that's going to play a major role too, right, with our own Constitution. One of the things that we see too is that obviously under the British Crown, right, the dominant branch, right, if you may, was an executive branch, right? So Parliament is a legislative branch, right? Like they help make laws. But the king or queen, right, the monarchs, they are what's called the executive. Their job is to enforce laws. And so one of the things that we see is that because we no longer had a king or a queen, The branch that's going to become important to the new states is going to be the legislative branches, right? Making of laws. Thomas Jefferson was very weary of that, though, because his whole thing was like, why should we trust a few men, right, or 50 or 100 or 173 men to make decisions or to make better decisions than one king? So after the revolution, the loyalist land was seized, but many loyalists did not lose their heads like they did eventually in France. Immediately following the war, goods from England were cut off, forcing many Americans to manufacture their own goods. Along with the boycotts that had happened, the fact that we actually had an embargo immediately following the war with England, and the fact that Northerners began to make their own stuff is going to play a major, major role in the eventual development of the northern states being manufacturer states, right, industrial states. Americans had great trade with England, but were now free to trade with foreign nations without restrictions of the mercantile system, right? Which is going to be important. It's part of what I hope you guys talked about in your essays. Americans were taught to disrespect private property, right? That's going to play a major role too, right? How do you get a group of people who you've just taught to essentially violate private property of loyalists? How do you tame them, right? How do you tame their revolutionary sort of spirit or fervor? So, people of the 13 colonies were far from being united, right? England began flooding American shores eventually. Even though we had an embargo, they began to eventually send a lot of their cheap products, right? Stuff that wasn't being bought. And the part of the problem was that they were sending it and giving certain states better rates than other states, right? Kind of getting states to turn against each other, right? Um, and so one of the things that we had going for us immediately after the Revolutionary War is the continued source of great leadership, and that's going to play a major role in steering us in the right direction. So one of the things that they did, like I said, right, is the new states, the Continental Congress. When they decided on a new government, they decided on a confederation. So it's a loose union of states, and so they even though they belonged to. So think about it as sort of being like Gunderson, right? Um, we like each classroom belongs to Gunderson, right? And so we sort of are a confederation, right? But obviously we understand that we are stronger as a school than we are as individuals. So the Articles of Confederation, they were finished in 1777, but they were not ratified until 1781. So there was a problem. So some of the states, like New York, they believed that they had New York, Virginia, they believed that they had access or rights to Western lands. And many of the other states who were sort of competing for some of those Western lands are going to argue that the rights to those Western lands came as a result of colonial charters. But since they had torn up their colonial charters, it should have been left up to a federal government to decide. So that was one thing keeping them from ratifying it. The other thing was taxes. A state like Rhode Island, which has fewer people than all the others, Rhode Island was like, well, why are we going to pay federal taxes, right? And so it wasn't until they agreed to resolve the land issues, the Western land issues, and it was not until Rhode Island, until they decided that they were going to not have federal taxes, that Rhode Island gave in also and signed. And so the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified or passed in 1781. So it was a weak system of government, but it was set up. If you think about it, it was set up from the very get-go as a distrust. When we get to the Civil War, one of the problems that the South is going to face is that they broke from the country because they thought the government was too strong. Think about what that meant for the Southern government, right? It's going to make it really difficult for them to run their government. So from the very get-go, right, the American states, the 13 states, they're going to distrust this idea of a big government. The Articles of Confederation had no real executive branch because, again, the executive was representative of a king, and they didn't want that. They also had a very weak Congress, and so essentially what would happen is you can send as many people as you wanted to Philadelphia, but only each state could only vote one time, and so you needed 2/3 of the majority for a bill to be ratified, first of all, and if that law actually sucked, you needed 100% of the states to actually amend it. So not only was it kind of a fragile way of like getting stuff passed, but it was a very ridiculous way of getting things amended if they weren't good. So the Congress could not regulate commerce also, and that's going to play a major role too. Again, because the states didn't want to give that power up to the federal government, and so each state got to regulate their own commerce or trade. And again, that's part of why England is going to be able to sort of divide and conquer the states, right, in terms of um, who got a better rate or not. Congress, like I said, could not collect federal taxes. As a result of not being able to collect federal taxes, we had no federal military. Each state were printing their own worthless money, so Congress did not necessarily have the power to mint their money or print money. And again, states were in direct competition for foreign trade. Although weak, though, the Articles of Confederation were a positive move in the right direction. A few positive things, though. So we have all this land west, right? So one of the things that the Articles of Confederation, or the government under the Articles of Confederation, did pass, which was a hallmark, was the Land Ordinance of 1785. And so this dealt with all of the land that was essentially acquired during the French and Indian War, the lands of the Ohio River Valley. And so what the Land Ordinance of 1785 did is it set up a way to essentially go out and evaluate the land. And so, go out there and sort of determine what was going to happen with that land. One of the things that they also decided with the Land Ordinance, right, was that that once it was decided on, one of the things that they would do is that they would divide it up into different parcels of land. And at a certain point, these new inhabitants would have to provide public education to people living there. Another land ordinance that was passed was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And so one of the things that happened, right, was that the Land Ordinance of 1785, what it basically did was set up a system of surveying the land. Again, what do we do with the land? Once we determined how the land was going to be used and people began to move, they should have been able to apply for statehood. And that's what the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 did. So once a territory had 60,000 people, they could write a constitution and apply for statehood. So again, you could see, example, right, the Ohio River Valley, kind of how they began to patch it up, right, the green, and you can see how they began to divide up the land. So England continued to be a thorn at the U.S. side. In 1784, Spain actually closed the Mississippi River to American commerce because they didn't want us going past the Mississippi. And if you remember, Spain owned the Mississippi area because they controlled Louisiana after the French and Indian War. One of the things that we began to see is that from Canada and from the West, the Spanish and the English continued to, or they began to supply the native people along the frontier with weapons so that they would hopefully instigate the Americans. France, at the end of the war, began to demand immediate repayment of debt. American shippers also began to have trouble with North African pirates. And that's going to be very key, too. One of the things that we'll see later, right, is that Jefferson will actually send the Marines there. That's part of why in the Marine song, right, it says, from the halls of Moctezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So Tripoli being in North Africa, but we'll talk more about that later. So one of the things that happened, right, the states were supposed to volunteer taxes. They were refusing to pay those taxes. American international credibility was weakening. And so at home, one of the things that was happening was that because there was no federal military, the states were kind of doing their own tax levying. In Massachusetts, the government of Massachusetts, which was actually run now by Samuel Adams, Mr. Revolution himself, they were actually taxing many of the farmers in Massachusetts, and a lot of these farmers were former soldiers of the Revolutionary War, and many of them were really upset that they were being taxed. And when they weren't able to pay the taxes, the government of Massachusetts actually began demanding that they pay their taxes in gold and silver, right? Very similar to what happened with the Currency Act. So eventually in 1786, a group of farmers in Massachusetts led by a man named Daniel Shea, they decided that because they were being overtaxed in similar fashion to the way that the colonists were being overtaxed by the British, they would lead a revolution on the Massachusetts State House. He was caught and convicted and later pardoned, but the rebellion, Shea's rebellion, had the impact, right, of getting the founding fathers to realize a few things, right? Like, A, this rebellion could have been quelled with essentially a national military, right? What if it got bigger? Do we have a national military to quell something like this? But B, it also makes them realize that part of what was wrong was the fact that we could not tax. And that the people actually believed they had this increased amount of democracy to the point where they could actually rebel whenever they wanted to. And the founding fathers wanted to make sure that they stayed in charge. So you can see here, Shea's rebellion shocked the founding fathers into rethinking about the desire for strong central government. Jefferson, in conversation with John Adams, John Adams wanted to know, like, what do you think about Shays' Rebellion? And Jefferson, in his letters to some of the founding fathers, specifically John Adams, he says, every generation needs a little revolution, right? Sometimes we need reminders of our freedom. And of course, he famously said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants from time to time. Like I said, right, every generation sort of needs a revolution to remind itself of its freedoms. So the founding fathers decided that they would hold a meeting somehow to try to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. So James Madison and Alexander Hamilton called for a convention in Annapolis, Maryland. So Alexander Hamilton was from New York, James Madison is from Virginia. And so one of the things that happened was only 5 of the states actually showed up. And Madison was crushed. Like, he was super upset. Right? He was like, oh no, like, what's going to happen, right? Because Madison was a firm believer that we had to have this federal government. Like, he was very much a nationalist that way. And he was really upset. And his whole feeling was like, what's going to happen is we're eventually going to end up with 13 countries if we're not careful. So Hamilton convinced Madison to try to hold a different meeting. He says, why don't we try to hold the second meeting, but we'll hold this meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Madison's response was, of course, well, wait a minute, why would they want to meet in Philadelphia if they didn't want to meet in Annapolis? And Hamilton has an idea. He says, why don't you invite George Washington? Why don't you tell him, that George Washington is coming? And Madison says, but I haven't asked George Washington. And he says, well, they don't know that. And so what Madison did is he sent out letters to the different states saying, we are going to hold another meeting to kind of take a look at the Articles of Confederation and determine whether they need fixing. This time we're going to hold the meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and George Washington is going to be there. Well, fortunately for Madison, people showed up, right? But obviously part of why they're showing up is because they're expecting George Washington to be there. So one of the things Madison had done was actually written George Washington, and Washington accepted and was actually there. So on May 25th, 1787, 55 representatives from 12 states, Rhode Island decided not to show up, met in Philadelphia, and what they were there to do was revise the Articles of Confederation. The meeting was sort of struck by Hamilton, Madison, and Franklin. Jefferson, John, and Sam Adams, Thomas Paine, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry were not there, and there was a question of whether or not they were too radical to be there. There's a picture, right, of them meeting at the Constitutional Convention. There's George Washington. So the 55 delegates were well off and mostly young. They essentially wanted to help preserve the Union, right? So they were nationalists. They hoped to protect American democracy from abroad, like some of the things that was happening, right, in terms of England and France. Like, they didn't want anybody coming in and trying to kind of play the states off each other, or maybe even trying to take over, right? And so they needed to be united in defense. But they also needed to protect it here at home. They wanted to make sure that they remain in charge because they felt like they were the best ones to be in charge, right? They wanted to curb the unrestrained democracy, right? And so one of the things that they will sort of that they will refer to people like who were involved in Shays' Rebellion is they call them the mobocracy. In other words, a mob who was trying to pursue democracy, but they did it in sort of this mob mentality without truly understanding how democracy worked. So when the Founding Fathers met, they decided that the Articles of Confederation simply just sucked, that they were not good enough, and so instead of revising them, they decided to throw them out, which left them with some very essential questions, right? And so the essential questions that they were left with was, okay, well, what do we do now, right? What type of government do we continue with? Who should have more power, a central or a central government or the individual states, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, we had the states having more power. What do we do about slavery? Will there be an executive branch? Will there be a judicial branch, right? So these are all individual questions that we're going to take a look at together in a second. So the first question that they had was, what type of government, right? So again, we had talked about how Thomas Paine argued for a republic. So one of the things that the founders realized was that the problem wasn't whether or not they were going to have a democracy, right? So the type of government wasn't the problem. It was the structure of the government, right? So the Articles of Confederation were not working in the way that they would have maybe have liked. So one of the things that we'll see, right, is that since the Articles were a loose confederation with no federal authority, they decided to make some changes. So one of the things I had to decide on was what type of democracy. So do we do a pure democracy where every single citizen gets to vote? Or do we do a republic, right? So when you think of a pure democracy, or a republic, think of it this way. Imagine prom. So you have some decisions to make for prom, right? So you have the what type of clothes can be allowed to wear, right? So a like rules and regulations in terms of a dress code, I should say. Where is prom going to be held? What kind of food? All these things. Who's going to be the DJ, right? So imagine all 1,200 Gunderson students being allowed to have a vote in a matter like that. That would be a pure democracy, right? Every single person's vote counts. In a republic, we have representatives. So if you think about it, the prom committee, the group of students that are charged with the duty of actually putting that stuff together, right? They are a part of a republic, right? Like they are representatives. So they decided that they were going to stick with a republic, okay, or a representative democracy. So, under the Articles of Confederation, the 13 individual states had control of their own government with weak central authority, right? So, one of the things that they had to think about was, well, one of the problems is that the federal government didn't have enough authority, and so the states had way too much power. But the states were, of course, unwilling to give a lot of power to the federal government. So, James Madison proposed the system of federalism. And so, essentially, what happens in federalism is that there is a sharing of power between the federal, or this case, the central government, and the individual states, and even the local government. Okay, understanding that the federal government would have ultimate authority. So the power is not expressed by the federal government; we left to individual states, right? So essentially, one way to look at it is that you essentially create. Let me just get the little pen here. Okay, so what you essentially do is you create, right, almost a cake like thing like this. You have the federal government, you have the state governments, and then you have the local governments. Okay? So if you think about it, right, there is one federal government, there are 50, right? And then there are hundreds, if not thousands, of local governments, right? You have the counties, you have city governments. There's one federal government. So the way that's under the Articles of Confederation, right, the states had the most authority. But the states, again, were unwilling to give full authority to the federal government. So under the system of federalism, the way that it works is every level of government has their own power. For example, San Jose makes laws for the city of San Jose. The federal government does not have to follow the laws of the city of San Jose because the federal government, right, is superior to the city of San Jose. But if the federal government makes a law, then everybody has to follow, right? So the way that it works is power flows this way, right? So if there's a law that exists at the federal level, the states have to follow it, which means the local governments have to follow it. A really good example of this, right? A couple of things that we'll talk about in class are both with gay marriage and something like drug use. But again, we'll save those for class. I just want to make sure that you guys understand this a little bit. System, the way that it was going to work is that the national government would be able to maintain a military, declare war, establish a postal system, set standards for weights and measures, protect things like copyrights and patents. Okay, the states would establish local governments, set up schools, regulate state commerce, make regulations for marriage, establish and regulate corporations. But some of the things that they share are things like collecting taxes. Both the state and national governments could. They could both establish courts, and we'll talk more about that in class. Regulating interstate commerce, regulate banks, borrow money, provide for the general welfare, and then also punish criminals. So again, we'll look at a little bit of detail with these. So the next question was regarding representation. So James Madison presented the Virginia plan, which was the large state plan. So James Madison, he basically said, look, we are going to create a bicameral instead of under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral. So he said, we're going to create a bicameral Congress. It would be two houses, an upper house and a lower house. So the lower house would be elected by the people, and the upper house would be elected by the lower house. And so the people wouldn't directly be electing the upper house. It would be very similar to the way that it was with Parliament. So representation should be based on the population of each state. Well, James Madison comes from Virginia, which was the most populous state at the time. And so for him, it made sense, right? The states with the bigger populations, they should have the most say. Now, who would have a problem with this? Well, obviously the smaller states would. So this is just what the Virginia plan looks like. Don't worry about the details. So William Patterson of New Jersey presented the New Jersey plan, called the small state plan. He said, no, there's no need to have a bicameral Congress. We'll just keep it at unicameral. But every state, regardless of size, would have a single vote. In this case, they would be given two votes, unlike the Articles of Confederation. So scratch this part about single vote. It would actually be two votes, unlike it was in the Articles of Confederation, right? But for James Madison and the large state people, they're going to look at it and be like, well, wait a minute, that's no different than it was under the Articles. All you did was add one more vote. So again, just a copy of the New Jersey plan. So luckily, a guy by the name of Roger Sherman of Connecticut presented what became known as the Connecticut Plan, otherwise known as the Great Compromise. So what he did is he blended both the small and large state plans, and they created a bicameral Congress. And he said on one side we will have a House of Representatives that would be done based on population. The House of Representatives would nominate 2 senators to the Senate. So you'd have a House and a Senate. So the House would be directly elected by people in the states, and the Senate would be elected by members of the House. And every state would get 2. Now, that changed in 1913. So the 17th Amendment in 1913 changed that, and now we actually directly elect our senators. So not only do we elect the representatives of the House, but we elect our senators. California has 53 members of the House because we are the most populous state now, and we have 2 members of the Senate, right? So 53 and 2. Remember that number. So just showing you the Great Compromise, right? So just kind of a breakdown. Again, you can pause it and look at it yourself. So a bicameral Congress would mean, right, that you'd have, people agreeing or disagreeing, right? So one of the things that has to happen, right, is because they are the legislative branch, they make the laws. In order for a presented bill to become a law, it has to pass both the House and the Senate. So one of the other questions that they had was, since they were now going to have some representation based on population, part of the question was, well, what do we do with these blacks? So the Southerners decided, well, since we're going to count the population, we want to count the slaves into the population. Now the Northerners are going to say, well, no, that would give you more power because you'll get more seats. So if you're going to count the African Americans as votes, as people, then you need to treat them that way, and you can no longer have slaves. So because the argument went back and forth, they eventually settled on what became known as the 3/5 Compromise, which was actually really embarrassing, right? So the idea was that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of the population. So if there were 500,000 of them, right, then 300,000 of them would be counted as part of the population, which would obviously still increase the number of people that the Southerners have in the legislature. So again, just a 3/5 compromise. Just again, you can pause and take a look at it a little bit. So then, one of the things they had to decide on too was they had to decide on the executive branch, right, and whether or not they were going to have a head, right? And again, they were really worried about that, but they needed somebody to be able to execute or carry out the laws. And so they created an executive branch. And so the executive branch is the president, vice president, right, the executive office. And then the president has a department, right? So these become his cabinet. But this is not outlined in the Constitution. The first president of the United States, George Washington, actually did this himself. So the president would be the military commander. They'd have the power of veto. They would be elected by the Electoral College. It's a very conservative system, right? Because we don't actually directly elect the president of the United States. I'm going to go over in class a little bit about how the Electoral College works. Essentially, the electoral votes are the number of senators plus a member of the House, or HORS in this case, right? And so I just told you California has 53 members of the House and 2 senators. So if you think about it, that's 55. So those 55, that's what California gets in terms of electoral votes. But again, I'll explain a little bit more in class. This is what the Electoral College vote was for the Obama-McCain campaign in 2012. And so we will talk a little bit about the 11 in the middle and why the 11 in the middle is blank like that for Missouri. But you can see the blue states are the states that President Obama won. And we'll take a look at this map a little bit too in class. The judicial branch was created by the Judiciary Act of 1789. It established the judiciary branch of the United States, essentially establishing the United States Supreme Court. Initially, it was 5 associate justices and 1 chief justice. Today, there are 9. So in 1869, They moved the number to 8 and 1 Chief Justice. And then the very first Chief Justice was a guy by the name of John Jay. He will actually help negotiate some treaties for us with England. So they also decided that one way to make sure, right, that to create some safeguards against the mob, they created a system of checks and balances. So the Supreme Court justices were, for example, appointed for life. The Electoral College created a buffer between the people and the presidency. At the beginning, senators were elected by state legislators, and the people voted for 1/3 of all the representatives. So we really, again, even from the beginning, even though they created this really quote-unquote democratic government, it was still very conservative and benefited the aristocracy in the country. So this is a sort of a map, an outline of the system of checks and balances. And so the idea was that you'd have one, two, these three branches, right? And so these three branches are able to check and balance. And so not one of them has more power than the other. So again, if the president is able to, if Congress carries out a law, right? At some point the Supreme Court could strike down that law. If the president states is behaving inappropriately, right, breaking federal law, the Supreme Court has the power to impeach the president, or begin that process that would eventually go to the Senate and the House. And then, so there are other things too, and again, we'll discuss these a little bit further in class. So another thing too, right, the idea of the separation of powers. So you have the judicial branch, the executive, and the legislative. So it's just, again, how they are separated. And then because there is a separation and because each is so powerful, there's the checks and balances. So initially the founders had sent copies of the new Constitution to state legislators for approval. The idea was to let the people judge for themselves. Americans were shocked what had happened to the Articles of Confederation. Benjamin Franklin, I'll tell you the story about him walking outside Philadelphia after the convention. So two political factions came out of the convention. One group were the Federalists, and factions meaning like groups, right? They favored a strong central government, right? So the Federalists favored a strong federal government. They were supported by bankers and businessmen who wanted to make sure that their money was invested well. And the leader that eventually emerges before them is a guy from New York, Alexander Hamilton. The Anti-Federalists, they feared and distrusted the strong central government, so they were very much in the Jeffersonian model, supported by the states' rights advocates and supported by farmers and frontiers. And again, they kind of saw Thomas Jefferson as their leader. So again, on the left you have Alexander Hamilton, on the right you have Thomas Jefferson. So Massachusetts had great debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Massachusetts finally agreed that they would sign the Constitution into law if the federal government could promise that a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution, and they should be written by a man from Virginia, and that man ends up being James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution. So New York was one of these states that also was unwilling to pass, and so Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, they got together and wrote a series of essays to convince New York to ratify. These series of essays became known as the Federalist Papers. So some of the idea behind the Federalist Papers was that these 13 individual states could actually perform and run a country on their own, and that they would be unison, and that's what it was like at the beginning. So again, you have the Federalist Papers. So the signing of the Constitution signified a peaceful transition. We had the Articles of Confederation; they weren't working, and we decided to change. And nobody died. Like, there were no fights, there was no war. It signified that a democracy could function. A quarter of adult white males in the country with land had voted for the ratifying of the delegates. So again, it's still very limited representation. And again, they had placed a lot of things to safeguard against the mob. The Federalists believed that every branch represented the people. The Anti-Federalists believed that only the House of Representatives did. And again, we'll go into more detail a little bit with some of these in class.